So Travis, I know that the Montana Human Rights Network does work on issues around an anti-environmental movement that exists in the state. And I would hope you could tell me a bit about that, and why would your group work on that kind of issue? What is this movement?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think in some ways, I think it speaks back to our organization broadening our mission early on, because we essentially work from the community level up and the state level down. What we started to notice was it's like, oh, in some communities, the same people that we knew that were attending local militia meetings were also the same people showing up at county commission land use planning meetings and talking about how counties should not implement planning because it was part of, this New World Order black helicopter conspiracy theory. Those were also in some cases the same people that worked at, local logging mills, or that worked at these, industry jobs, that were also sort of pushing out this language, especially in the 80s and going into the 90s, about how, loggers, miners, farmers, ranchers, they were really the true environmentalists because they're the ones that work the land and do something with the land. And so we started to really, I think, try to understand ourselves how all of that fit together. And what we really figured out are there are these certain ideas out there that provide an avenue for connecting more of these far-right views to what I would call sort of a mainstream anti-environmental movement. And one of the big ones that we talk a lot about is this idea of county supremacy. At the national level, there are basically two versions of county supremacy. You have sort of the militia-oriented version that's very focused on the county sheriff, and that the county sheriff is the highest legitimate law officer in the country, and that it's really the sheriff's job to protect citizens of the county from any kind of encroachment on their individual liberties. Now, from the militia perspective, that means, okay, if the federal government tries to come in and enforce gun control regulations, the sheriff should not allow that to happen. If you have kind of a militia member who doesn't pay their taxes, like, the IRS shouldn't be able to come in and sell their property to make up for those taxes. But you also started to see it bleed over, especially kind of in the 80s, after a lot of national environmental regulations were passed, that, if a farmer wants to use a certain pesticide that the EPA says they shouldn't be able to use, that if they come in and try to do any enforcement around that, the county sheriff should protect the farmers. So you have kind of this militia version of county supremacy, very focused on the supremacy of the county sheriff. You also have this kind of county supremacy notion that exists in the anti-environmental movement, whether that was sort of the sagebrush rebellion of the 70s, going into the wise use movement of the 80s and 90s, or now, what's personified most by like the Bundy family standoffs. But you have kind of this anti-environmental one that focuses a little bit more on the county commission, and this idea that the county commission should have jurisdiction over all of the land within its county's boundaries. So that includes federal lands, public lands, that they should be able to make decisions about what happens on those lands. And most of the time that involves like how many board feet of timber they should be able to log out of the national forest in their county, or things like that. So at the national level, there's kind of these two versions, one that focuses on the county commission, one that focuses on the county sheriff. But as we often say, at the local level, all of that bleeds together. So you have individuals that carry around both of those ideas that have merged into one. And that's what we would see a lot of times at these county planning meetings, where it wasn't just, hey, we don't think that the federal government should be able to basically tell us what to do with our property, with property within the county. But then you'd add on this notion that, and frankly, if they're going to try to do that, if their agents show up in our county, our federal sheriff should be arresting them and putting them in prison. So that's one of these issues, and there are a few other ones, but that's a big one that helps sort of bridge that gap that I think a lot of people feel exists between just people that, maybe against certain environmental regulations and then sort of these gun-toting militia members, that at the community level, you see a lot of crossover of those contingencies because of things like county supremacy.
Yeah, and so one of the things that it seems like you're saying is that this is a pretty extreme perspective, right? That is with this far right, like militia groups. But there's also a very like legitimate conversation or to be had around things like whether we should have regulation and whether that should impinge on people's individual liberties, right? So in other words, it seems to me and that a lot of the groups that you're talking about are taking this notion of individual liberty to like that's the most important thing, that's the primary thing that's important is the individual liberty. Because I would guess if you like you were mentioning, county commissions should be able to take over the public land in certain counties. But I bet those people would not say that the county commission should come and regulate their land use, right? We see a lot of these issues around land use here in Missoula County, for instance, where you see property rights concerns coming up against environmental concerns, and the sense that those two cannot be reconciled. And now I'm not sure, I just, I think we can reconcile them in certain ways with creativity. But it seems to me that a lot of this comes down to individual freedom. And what are you arguing against that? Against individual freedom?
No, I mean, I think what we really try to educate folks about is this dynamic. And part of the dynamic I think that you're describing there is something that we call margins to the mainstream, which is how do these ideas and these perspectives that originate at militia meetings, for instance, how do they make their way into these mainstream political circles where a lot of us are trying to have those legitimate discussions and debates that you're talking about? And how do these kind of far-right activists then try to use mainstream kind of points of contention in order to interject themselves into the mainstream in order to try to recruit people out of more mainstream circles into their broader kind of far-right ideology? And I think this is a perfect example of how a good far-right organizer doesn't go into a community and look around and be like, okay, these are the people that are building consensus on some of these tough issues. How can I add value to that? No, they come into a community and they look for these issues that are culture war issues in those communities, these issues that are divisive, that are dividing people, and they try to interject themselves into that situation and wedge people off of that to basically recruit them into a movement that then we feel is much more dangerous, that is, views the federal government as this enemy, that talks about how, martial law is imminent, that there's going to be this next American Revolution. So they're trying to find avenues to do that. And I think one of the best examples of that I've ever heard is there was this guy named Floyd Cochran who for years was involved with the Aryan Nations over in northern Idaho. And not just some like, send your $25 in every year to be a member, but he actually lived at the Aryan Nations compound outside of Hayden. He was like their communications director. I mean, he had a title, he had one of their uniforms, he was part of that leadership. Well, he eventually, in the early 90s, left the white nationalist movement. And so we had brought him on a speaking tour in Western Montana. And one of the things that he told those communities was, hey, when I was working for Aryan Nations and we wanted to start organizing in a community, I didn't go in and use racial slurs right away. I went in and used the spotted owl. And this was back in the 80s when the spotted owl controversy was huge and was having a real negative impact on local logging communities, and sort of all of that was going on. And so that was the issue that they used to try to come in, establish themselves in a community and start trying to recruit people. That it's like, well, if we can get people that are, that are mad at the federal government about environmental regulations, and we can use that as the hook to sort of draw them in, that if they already hate the government and they're mad, and we can bring them along a little bit, maybe we can eventually get them to that point where they agree with us that Jewish people control the federal government and get them to buy into that bigger agenda. So I think you're exactly right that there's a very big difference between community members who have different perspectives on land use and property rights issues that are coming together and trying to hammer out proposals that probably in the end nobody gets everything they want, but are trying to figure out real answers for communities, versus these far-right activists that are going to try to inject themselves into these divisive debates, make these debates even more divisive, and more divisive, and trying to recruit people then into their larger agendas.
But, speaking of agenda, I actually wanted to ask you about Agenda 21, because as you know, that is the United Nations statement for sustainable development goals, and a lot of people express concern about that agreement, and even so much so that specific sustainability initiatives, like in a community, are being contested based on this concern about the United Nations and Agenda 21. Could you explain the background of that and what your experience is with that issue?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, that is a perfect example of this margins to the mainstream dynamic that we talk about. And for me, I had never heard of Agenda 21 until I started working at the Montana Human Rights Network back in 1999. And back then, the internet was around, but it wasn't being used as an organizing tool. And so you still signed up to receive organizational newsletters that came in the mail. So one of the ones that we always got was one called Taking Aim by the Militia Montana that was based up in Knoxon, up in Sanders County. And one of my jobs at that point is I read all of this stuff that came in, and I was fairly new to all of this. And so I would occasionally come across something that I didn't really know about. And I'm flipping through one of the Militia Montana newsletters one day, and they've got this article about how Agenda 21 is part of this New World Order, one world government conspiracy theory to basically enslave the United States of America to the United Nations. And I had never heard the term Agenda 21 before. So I went next door to my supervisor's office and said, what is Agenda 21? And she explained to me, just like you did, kind of a 30,000 foot view of what Agenda 21 is. And I was like, oh, okay. And again, that kind of made sense to me, and kind of this emerging understanding I had of, okay, so the militia movement has all of these one world government conspiracy theories, and they've plugged Agenda 21 in as one of the evil actors that's helping push that along. Well, in the 15 years or however long it's been that I've been at the network, I've seen that term and that idea around these conspiracy theories and these fears around Agenda 21 migrate from Militia Montana newsletters into mainstream public policy debates, where we have a few legislative sessions ago had a legislator that introduced an anti-Agenda 21 resolution to be considered by the Montana legislature.
Really?
You see it, like you said, over and over mentioned as this, horrible, very kind of nefarious plot over and over in community settings when city councils, county commissions, local government bodies are talking about anything around sustainability. And I mean, I go to these conferences, these far-right conferences where people will get up and give entire presentations about how, the whole purpose of Agenda 21 is to herd people from rural areas into cities to get rid of all private property rights, that, it's part of this big plan to enslave Americans, under martial law into this one world government. And it's become, I feel like in the 1990s, the catch term for these one world government conspiracy theories was the New World Order. I feel like in a lot of ways, Agenda 21 has just become kind of a newer catchphrase to encompass this conspiracy theory that exists out on the far right that continues, I think, to make inroads into more kind of mainstream public policy debates.
Well, yeah, and again, I think with Agenda 21, the perception that people have is that somehow it will take away their individual liberties, right? If we enact sustainability initiatives, for instance, in our communities, right? Maybe they're not gonna let us drive our cars anymore, or they're gonna make us all recycle, or they're gonna make us all compost. And so there's a real resistance to regulation or trying to control human behavior, which it's perceived that environmental problem solving will require. And so it seems to me it comes from a very similar place, so that we see with Agenda 21, it's, probably most people couldn't tell you the very specifics of Agenda 21. And yet it's become this catchphrase for somehow these sustainability efforts and other efforts are going to coerce us and take, and not just big government like at the federal level, but even at the community level. One other thing this reminded me of, and is that, do you remember years ago, the city of Missoula was a member of a group called ICLEI, which is basically a group that, I can't remember the exact acronym, but basically they support cities in moving towards sustainability. And we had a membership in that. And there was a very strong outpouring from the right that was very organized, that came in and opposed that, and had literally got people from around, like this happened around the country. They got a lot of cities to withdraw their membership in this group, ICLEI. I don't know if you remember that, or were you involved in that fight at all at the time?
Not extensively. I remember it, and I remember as kind of that opposition really started to coalesce, getting phone calls from members we had in and around the Missoula area that were saying, these people are showing up and ranting about, something called Agenda 21. So I think that the other thing, I guess two things that this brings to mind for me are, I think one of the dynamics that you're describing is sort of this tension, I feel like, that I think has sort of always existed in our communities in this country, between the idea of where do individual rights start and end, and where does sort of community responsibility and sort of community level action begin. And I feel like that tension has been there forever. I think you go back to starting out with America being under the Articles of Confederation, where it was sort of like the states kind of got to do whatever they wanted. And that's obviously very simplistic, but, that was very much more focused on more of a local control model, to the Constitution, where a little bit more of that power shifted to the federal government. I think that tension and that give and take has been there since the beginning, and I think plays out in communities on a broad range of issues. And that, I think, goes back to what you were saying before, that it's like I absolutely think, good faith actors from all perspectives that want to engage on these issues that come up, want to try to have these difficult decisions, want to try to figure out, in policy where we draw those lines, so that there's a balance for individual versus community, and that continues to work together. I think the problem with far right people hijacking these discussions is they don't want that resolution. They don't really want to come to, okay, we'll give here, they'll give there. This is kind of that balance that we're going to strike. they
Right.
want to blow these situations up. And I think that, you know, when I think back to that Missoula kind of time period, we again were watching people that we knew from militia activity from both Missoula, and you had people coming up from like Ravalli County that didn't even live in the county that were, you know, testifying at city council hearings and behind that push. And I think that again is, you know, the influence that these folks can have is they come in and they don't want to have a legitimate discussion. They don't want to talk about creating good policy. They want to make these situations more contentious, more divisive. And really, you know, it's all about sort of pushing communities apart in order to recruit than it is about having any sense of trying to bring a community together to address these real situations and these real tensions that exist. And I think the second part of that that goes along with it is we have seen around really land use planning and property rights issues time and time again, that as far-right activists get involved, these arenas, these hearings where public policy and public comment is taking place, people who don't agree with that get scared. Like they get scared when you come in and there are these 20 militia folks that get up and talk about how, you know, this is a one world government conspiracy plan, that anybody who backs this is a traitor, you know, blah, 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 blah. That makes these public hearings and these public opportunities for people to come and present their opinions toxic places. And so you find people that don't share those viewpoints oftentimes get scared out of coming to testify at hearings. And so you lose, again, that ability to have people from across the board with different perspectives coming to hearings and feeling safe to get up and say, this is what I think, and working towards a solution.
And do you think it would be fair to say that some of the left engages in that kind of behavior, or is that?
You know, I think so. I think that is absolutely possible, and I think that it can happen. What I would say, though, is at least sort of in the circles of people that I'm around, I think that liberals and progressives tend to say that all opinions have value and all opinions should be shared. And so I think that the approach can be a little bit different. We years ago, and I think this idea of you know, like kind of the violent left, or you know, the far left, is something that's put out there, and I think there are examples of it that do exist. But years ago, we were dealing with, up in the Flathead area, a radio station that the host would get on, and he had, I forget if it was 2 or 3 hours every morning, that he would talk about local conservationists, and he would talk about, name them, he would talk about, you know, sometimes where they lived, you know, where they were seen in public, and lo and behold, want to know what happened? A lot of those people were then targeted by harassment and intimidation. So while we were putting that report together, there were all of these people from the natural resource industry that were saying, yes, but eco-terrorists. Yes, but eco-terrorists. You know, this kind of idea that, okay, there's problems on the right, there's problems on the left. So we actually did a fairly extensive FOIA requesting through Forest Service, through BLM, through various land use agencies in the state, and asked them to send us information they had of these eco-terrorist events. And in some cases, people would point to, oh, well, there was, you know, tree spiking going on in this area at this point in time. And so we ended up putting quite a bit of effort into trying to run down some of those. And pretty much in every case, like the things that we found from the land use agencies did not live up to the stories that we had heard that we were trying to verify.
Mm-hmm.
I'm definitely not going to sit here and say people, I mean, I think that people from all sorts of political viewpoints, there's the possibility that you can have, you know, extreme views coming in, but I do feel like in a lot of these instances, especially sort of in the public policy arena, that we see the far right having more of an influence and then sort of determining who feels safe getting up and talking about policies than we do necessarily the far left having some sort of equal pressure.
Yeah. And you know, maybe another way to think about it is we all need really good education about how to participate well in public discussions, myself included. I mean, I've been doing this, you know, been involved in public dialogues for decades now. And I still think, oh, I could do this better or that better. And we're probably learning this less and less today. I think our kids are so on. But let me, I got one last question for you before we wrap up, Travis. This has been really interesting. And as I was thinking today about our lecture topic in this class and the fact that, you know, some very core beliefs in this country are tied to both extreme, but also very legitimate questions that may arise regarding implementation of sustainability efforts or policies and so on. And, you know, the kind of ideas we've talked about today are things like individual liberties, the concern that environmental protection might mean restricting our personal freedoms. And, you know, also this idea that of distrust of the government, increasingly distrust of media. And I was thinking about our current coronavirus crisis as I was, you know, thinking about these core ideas, and that seems to me something we're facing as a society right now. It's like, are we willing to give up our individual freedoms for the common good, right, in this case? Have you guys been talking about that at all, or what are your thoughts?
Yeah, and I mean, I think, again, that kind of goes back to that tension that we talked about before that's sort of always there. But I think to your point about, you know, people trying to be better about kind of how they participate in policy discussions and policy development, I do think that one of the pieces that is really hard right now is, I think our current kind of political arena just sort of feels so toxic that I think a lot of people across the board feel like, well, I'm not, like, I don't want to engage in that. I don't want to be part of that. There's no point in being part of it. And by doing that, you know, we just, I think, continue to sort of lose those voices who are willing to step in and say, look, I may not agree with you on everything, but yeah, we should be able to have a discussion about this. And I feel like, I think we hear a lot from our members across the state and different communities that it just feels like there's less and less space for those discussions to happen. Because, and I think it's for a wide range of reasons, but I think part of it is I think a lot of people are just so turned off by how politics is playing out now that they don't want to engage. And so I think that you know, that is definitely a real problem. I think that, like you said, I think we all need to think about how can we start to have some of those discussions. And, you know, one of the things that, and one of your classes that I talked to, I guess it was last year, some students came up and we were talking afterwards. And, you know, one of the things that I said is, I think that, you know, organizations have their style and they have the policies that they want to work on and are mobilizing people. I think there's that level that you can, like, get involved with those efforts, but I think there's also the interpersonal piece. And I think that, you know, the example that I use because it applies is, you know, your uncle at Thanksgiving dinner, you know, those family members that, you know, have very different worldviews than you do. And one of the things I always really encourage people to do at these times is, it's like, with the people that you're interacting with, you may want to talk about, you know, big sustainability plans and, like, the policies that we'd like to see. And you may know that your uncle at Thanksgiving dinner isn't going to agree with you. And so I really encourage people on an interpersonal level to think about, okay, if this is the issue that I want to talk about with this person, if I start at, let's work with the city of Missoula to pass sustainability policies, they're immediately just going to want to fight with me about it. You know, it's immediately going to turn into an argument. But can I think of, based on what I know about this other person that I'm interacting with, can I think about kind of underlying values that are sort of underlying policies that, you know, I think are important that this person I'm talking to might not agree with, but are there underlying values that we can start a discussion about? Well, okay, let's not start coffee today by, you know, jumping into a big fight over sustainability policies in Missoula, but is there a value discussion that we can start at? And to try to sort of walk some of these things back a little bit in interpersonal dialogue so you can actually have a discussion and it doesn't just immediately go to an argument.
But that's interesting because some of those things immediately got like they're buzzwords like sustainability. So that you're saying like that could trigger people and you could talk about more the core values underlying it of clean water and clean air and healthy kids.
Yeah. No, I think you're exactly right. And I think that a lot of those terms, and not just in kind of conservation and sustainability circles, but kind of across various issue work, have become, these terms that people just hear and immediately decide, oh, I absolutely like that or I absolutely hate that. And so, yeah, I think that, and again, this is more kind of just those personal conversations as you're going through your daily life, whether it's at work, it's at class, it's, you know, whoever, with extended family members, that I think that is a way maybe to be able to start to have some discussions. Okay, let's not go to that buzzword right now that's going to immediately put us into camps that disagree. Are there those underlying values that I think that we could agree on so we can start to have a discussion? And I mean, it's one of those things where I don't have any sort of peer-reviewed academic proof that works, but I know anecdotally it's worked for me. I know anecdotally it's worked for other people. And I think that it at least is a way of trying to start to have some of these discussions leading up to, you know, these bigger policy debates that where I feel like people just immediately take a side. It's maybe a slightly different way to start having discussions about issues that have become these buzzwords.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, this has been really helpful, Travis. I really appreciate you taking the time and sharing your thoughts with us today. And do you have any last words for the students in these times?
Yeah, not really. I mean, I would really encourage people to, even though, you know, the politics these days can feel really divisive and engaging in policy debates and all of that. I mean, I feel like it's still so important that people engage in our democratic processes, that they engage, you know, when you have the opportunity to go to a meeting and offer comments on a policy, do that. You know, take advantage of the opportunities that are out there to educate yourself on issues, and then, you know, be willing to stand up and say, hey, this is what I think. I think too often we can feel like, oh, this policy is being debated. I don't know it front to back. I don't understand all of the complexities of it. Therefore, my opinion doesn't matter. I think people should understand that going in and testifying can be as simple as saying, this is what I think. This is why I think this is important. And, you know, you don't have to pretend to be a policy expert if you're not a policy expert, but that doesn't mean that you can't share how you feel about something and explain why it's important to you. And I just would encourage people to continue, you know, educate yourselves and then, you know, continue to take those opportunities to help shape and give input in the communities that we live in.
Yeah, one of my favorite expressions is the world is run by those who show up.
Yeah,
It's so
yeah,
true, and that's exactly what you just said, right? If we don't show up, then we're ceding the playing field, if you will, to those that do.
yeah.
And, you know, we may not be right all the time. I certainly know I'm not, but I can't let that stop me. It's an excellent point, because ultimately these questions really are about values and the direction we want society to go, both in terms of how we treat each other and treat the land. So thank you so much, Travis. And I'm going to turn off the recording here.